Hey guys, so if you saw our last video, now you know why it's been so long since we put up a video. And you'll probably hear my voice, I'm a little bit under the weather. It's that thing where you've had a big project you've been working on for a long time and you finally get to the end and you sort of crash a little. But this is a video I have wanted to put up for a couple months now, and I needed to get the movie done first, and now I finally can. Because you have to see there's a much larger picture here. A fellow researcher recently reminded me that all knowledge of any social importance begins as esoteric occult knowledge, and it's hidden from the masses. Then it's propagated through science fiction, books, and then later TV and movies to condition the masses.
Then come to Recall Incorporated, where you can buy the memory of your ideal vacation cheaper, safer, and better than the real thing, for the memory of a lifetime.
And then eventually that thing becomes science fact.
We will not only be able to transfer knowledge, but we will be able to transfer memories. Now, so you could have an experience like skydiving, and all of a sudden you could transfer that experience to a friend. And all of a sudden, they have experienced what you have experienced.
Despite its trailer quite obviously being held back in views on here since the first day we put it up, as most of you are aware, the documentary we've been researching and working on for over 3 years now is finally out. And I saw that a few people recognize that the topic touches on MKUltra, which is the CIA's unethical mind control experimentation that was carried out on unwitting citizens during the Cold War. And they went, oh, I already know that story. And they kind of shrugged it off. And I would just say to that, after 3 years of research, I beg to differ that you know that whole story. The first 20 minutes of the movie probably dispenses with what most people know about that story. There's another 3+ hours, okay? So there's way more to it, and it bears directly on the things that are going on today. And if you look into World War II, and really research it for any length of time, you'll easily find that there were some super rich elite industrialists who were funding both sides of that thing as a means to an end, and that end being a new direction for society altogether. People affiliated with what would become the United Nations after the war ended were having meetings all throughout World War II about what kind of society they would like to build after it was over, and really what kind of citizen they would like to build to live in that society. And when the UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, held its first meeting after the war where they became official, they discussed the importance of communication and putting all of us on a common communications network, so to speak.
And in the free exchange of ideas and knowledge, are agreed and determined to develop and to increase the means of communication between their peoples, and to employ these means for the purposes of mutual understanding and a truer and more perfect knowledge of each other's lives.
Maybe they didn't use those terms, but it's just no one at that time really had any concept of what any of that kind of talk meant. But it's pretty obvious what it means if you look around today. By the 1950s, there was a shift in science. There was a shift in biology. There was a shift in the way we were being looked at and studied. And it wasn't even as human beings anymore necessarily. It was more examined as biological computers in terms of information. Our DNA being looked at as a language, a programming language, that if you knew that information, then you could alter that information. Many of the concepts that we are dealing with today, such as transhumanism, the singularity, the idea of the matrix, those things came from this time period of experimentation. They came out of the 40s and 50s in the post-World War II era. That's where that stuff comes from. It didn't come from a science fiction novel or a Hollywood studio. Before it was ever a movie, it was secret meetings that were being had during and after World War II about this.
Déjà vu.
Just like I said at the beginning of the video, The Matrix was being discussed at length by the people we discuss in the film we just made. And their meetings led up to MKUltra. So it was occult knowledge. Then, decades later, before the boom of all this technology was upon us.
If you look at a world where we have these chips that are connected to the internet, all of a sudden, every piece of information on the internet becomes accessible to our minds.
I know Kung Fu.
Before 9/11 happened, which would justify the putting in of a lot of this surveillance technology that's all around us today, they put out the movie The Matrix. But it was definitely not a new concept. And that movie has been pretty instrumental in priming us towards the world that we're living in now. So a couple of months ago, Google put out a video that's been dubbed the Selfish Ledger. And I don't know if you saw it, but even if you did, maybe you didn't see exactly what's going on in this video. The claim is that this was just an internal training video within Google, but if that's the case, then why did they release it to the press? They wanted everyone to know. This is one of those cases where something comes out because they want people to know it. It wasn't an accident or oopsie, that video we made for our internal training thingy, which we obviously spent a lot of time making, just accidentally got leaked to everyone. Whoops, they say stuff like that, but clearly this was some information that it was time to tell us about. This video is about what they can do with all of the data they have now amassed on everyone all of these years. And I'm going to leave a link in the description to the entire video. It's a little over 8 minutes. I'm not going to play it all here. I'm just going to play a few clips so you get the idea. The beginning of the video is about discussing information in evolutionary terms. It quickly goes on to talk about how our user data online, everything we buy, everyone we interact with, every opinion we share, every time we click like on something, this creates a codified version of ourselves.
When we use contemporary technology, a trail of information is created in the form of data. When analyzed, it describes our actions, decisions, preferences, movement, and relationships. This codified version of who we are becomes ever more complex, developing, changing, and deforming based on our actions. In this regard, this ledger of our data may be considered a Lamarckian epigenome, a constantly evolving representation of who we are.
A coded version of ourselves that creates basically this ledger, a constantly evolving digital version of ourselves. But it isn't just that they have this thing. The narrator of the video goes on to say that this ledger of ourselves can actually be directed toward a goal.
What if the ledger could be given a volition or purpose, rather than simply acting as an historical reference? What if we focused on creating a richer ledger by introducing more sources of information? What if we thought of ourselves not as the owners of this information, but as custodians, transient carriers, or caretakers?
And then they break it up into these parts. Part 1 is an Italian phrase that I will likely butcher, but what it means is talking cricket. So part 1 is basically Jiminy Cricket. So part 1 is your conscience.
Initially, the notion of a goal-oriented ledger may be user-driven. As an organization, Google would be responsible for offering suitable targets for a user's ledger. Whilst the notion of a global good is problematic, topics would likely focus on health or environmental impact to reflect Google's values as an organization. Once the user selects a volition for their ledger, every interaction may be compared to a series of parallel options. If one of these options allows the ledger to move closer to its goal, it will be offered up to the user. Over time, by selecting these options, the user's behavior may be modified and the ledger moves closer to its target.
The narrator goes on to say, initially, this process will be user-driven.
Initially, the notion of a goal-oriented ledger may be user-driven.
But I feel like that bears repeating, that he said initially. Initially, it's user-driven, which by virtue of the fact that he says initially suggests that at some point it won't be user-driven. And so your options will still reflect Google's values, not necessarily the user's values, mind you. A person can choose a goal within the given parameters of Google's values, and the technology on the phone will then use every available bit of data to steer a person towards whatever that goal is. A process that over time will likely become so constant and so seamlessly integrated with all of the person's shopping and communication, social interactions with their phone, places they go, things that they do, etc., that the person's probably not even going to notice anymore that their behavior is now being continuously modified through the feedback loop of this technology. Cybernetics, as coined by Norbert Wiener back in the late 40s, was about communication and control in the animal and the machine. And it requires a feedback loop. So for this behavior modification feedback loop system to work, it's going to require more and more data to continuously modify the person's behavior. That's how it works. It's putting yourself into a feedback loop with your phone, which everyone's already in anyway, technically, with all the dings and people being conditioned to constantly jump every time they hear their phone buzz or whatever. That's already conditioned behavior. But that's what this is. This is a feedback loop for behavior modification. And I would just like to also point out that the reference here cannot be missed to the fact that a talking cricket, he's talking about basically Jiminy Cricket. So what we're really talking about here is Pinocchio, and Pinocchio was a puppet. So, other than it being in Italian, it's not really veiled what's being talked about here. It's pretty obvious. Part 2 is the Quill of Cornelius Fudge. If you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, Cornelius Fudge is the Minister of Magic, and his quill is a self-writing quill. It writes by itself. So the part 2 is about a pin or a tool that works on its own. It does not need the tool owner to touch it or interact with it at all. It does its job on its own. Keep that in mind when you watch this.
As this line of thinking accelerates and the notion of a goal-driven ledger becomes more palatable, suggestions may be converted not by the user, but by the ledger itself. In this case, the ledger is missing a key data source, which it requires in order to better understand this user. In order to plug the gap in its knowledge, the ledger begins searching for a device which delivers the required data when used. From this list, the ledger begins sorting the options most likely to appeal to the user in question. In situations where no suitable product is found, the ledger may investigate a bespoke solution. By analyzing historical data, it is increasingly possible to discern qualitative information such as taste and aesthetic sensibility, which may be used in the creation of a design proposal. A custom object may be created to trigger this user's interest.
So in part 2, the computer will start making decisions using the person's data without them even realizing it. Ways to sell them items that help the computer plug the gaps in its knowledge that will then help it to further modify the behavior towards the goal. And that right there, by the way, is the evolution of the suggested sell. You know how if you go on Amazon or something and you buy a book and then it brings up a list, oh, people who bought this book also like this book and this book, or based on other things you bought, you might also want these 5 things. That's suggested sell on the base level. But this, the self-writing quill, the self-driven computer that decides its own goals now for you and will just start working towards those goals for you, going to create situations now where it will be able to garner the information it needs. And the person's probably not even going to realize that's happening. And sure, they give a really seemingly harmless example of it coming up with an idea to try to get the person to buy a scale so that it can figure out the person's weight or whatever. But that is a surface level interpretation of where this could go. In short, the person's no longer making decisions using the computer as a tool, but the tool itself is now gaming the person and steering that person towards making the decisions that the AI, I guess, has determined that person should make to reach the end goal, which the person, again, initially they signed up for this process. Initially, it's a user-driven process. So where's all this headed? Well, part 3 is a Latin phrase, unus pro omnibus, which means one for all.
User data has the capability to survive beyond the limits of our biological selves, in much the same way as genetic code is released and propagated in nature. By considering this data through a Lamarckian lens, the codified experiences within the ledger become an accumulation of behavioral knowledge throughout the life of an individual. As new users enter an ecosystem, they begin to create their own trail of data. By comparing this emergent ledger with the mass of historical user data, it becomes possible to make increasingly accurate predictions about decisions and future behaviors. As cycles of collection and comparison extend, it may be possible to develop a species-level understanding of complex issues such as depression, health, and poverty. Our ability to interpret user data, combined with the exponential growth in sensor-enabled objects, will result in an increasingly detailed account of who we are as people. As these streams of information are brought together, the effect is multiplied. New patterns become apparent and new predictions become possible.
As more and more people go through this process, Google is able to develop a species-level understanding of social problems in its users. The understanding that everyone has been driven towards, that is based, like he said at the beginning, on Google's values. In other words, society will understand what they want people to understand and how they want them to understand it as a whole, all together. And I guess we literally become an AI-driven herd, which leads us to behavioral sequencing. That's right, behavioral sequencing.
As the examination of protein structures paved the way to genetic sequencing, the mass, multi-generational examination of actions and results could introduce a model of behavioral sequencing. As gene sequencing yields a comprehensive map of human biology, researchers are increasingly able to target parts of the sequence and modify them in order to achieve a desired result. As patterns begin to emerge in the behavioral sequences, they too may be targeted. The ledger could be given a focus, shifting it from a system which not only tracks our behavior, but offers direction towards a desired result.
So through meta-analysis of our user data, they will be able to help make leaps in our understanding and offer a direction towards a desired result. But whose result is that ultimately going to be when you're steering everyone together? I mean, this is a herd. This is a hive. This is not my individual preference or someone else's individual goal. This is now the steering of society at large through this process. So whose desired end result is that serving? Not the individual. So the leaps in our human understanding will be computer-driven and based on Google's values. I mean, is that basically what he's saying? It sounds like that's what he's saying to me. And because of that being what he's saying, it puts a whole new meaning on the fact that throughout this entire video is the ambient sound of crickets in the background and clips of ants and bees and wasps and locusts, hive creatures.
We are at the very beginning of our journey of understanding in the field of user data. By applying our knowledge of epigenetics, inheritance, and memetics to this field, we may be able to make mental leaps in our understanding, which could offer benefits to this generation, to future generations, and the species as a whole.
Social hives. And that's what he's showing basically this entire video while they're in this lead up to a hive mind that they claim they can now create using all of our data. And this right here is why understanding what happened to not just this country, but the world after World War II, why that was so important, where we were headed with all of this experimentation is really key to understanding how we got where we are today and being able to look at what's happening today and understand why it's happening. I think a lot of people are really confused how society got the way it is and where it's headed and what's happening. And I think some of that confusion gets dispelled if you see the film we just put out. I mean, this is the essence of directed human evolution right here. Not natural. This is not natural just because everyone came up with technology. This is naturally what they're going to do with it. That's not true. And another thing that isn't true that people say all the time, and I'm sure that I have said it. I am sure if I went back and watched all my videos, I could find myself even saying it. But I have to say, after all of the research we did on this movie for the last 3+ years, I can tell you unequivocally that I no longer agree that all technology is neutral. It just depends on how you use it, or you hear people say this a lot. And I'm sure I've said it before too. And what I'm saying to you now is that is simply untrue. Because when you start getting into the realm of talking about social values, computer-driven social values on a society-wide level, you're now talking about something that is most definitely based on the creators of that technology, the programmers of that technology, and what they're bringing to the table before you ever even see that technology, before they ever even announce to the public that technology exists. I mean, the guy straight up says, this is based on Google's values. Does that sound neutral to you? Quite obviously not. With as many people that are getting censored and just, I mean, whatever. That statement just falls apart. There's no way to even make that statement and stand by it. It's not neutral. It's very much dependent on the programmers, the coders, the algorithms, what's going into that. What are you putting in to get the goal that you want to begin with? I mean, this is not neutral. And it's just like saying all this other stuff we have is neutral until you use it. I mean, to a point, but what you're really talking about is the internet and computers. These were military weapons of war before they ever came to you. I mean, GPS, all of it. This is all military products and DARPA created products. The internet was created, and we touch on this in our film, by an experimental psychologist, guys. Not just any person. It was an experimental psychologist, J.C.R. Licklider. He was fundamental in creating what we now know today as the internet. So if you thought it was a computer programmer or something like that, nope, it was an experimental psychologist. That is something to keep in mind. And there are people that I know because we get the same trolls every time. You know, I did a video on how the creators of Facebook, for example, were talking about how they made Facebook knowing for a fact it's based on conditioning people through feedback loops, social validation feedback loops.
Means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you, more likes and comments. And it's a social validation feedback loop. I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
They came out and they admitted that, and then I made that video and I put it on YouTube and I posted it on Facebook, and there are people that come in and say, well, you posted that on Facebook. Yeah, it's about Facebook. Where else would I post it? It's not like I'm going to print out a flyer about it and tack it to a tree on my street corner. That's not really going to make much of a point, is it? So yes, this is about Google, but where else would I put it but here? I mean, we have to start having some of these conversations as a society, don't we? At some point, when the companies are coming out, these giant mega corporations that are running everything, and most importantly, our data, and they're having these kinds of discussions, apparently internally and now externally, since they've quote unquote leaked this video to the public. So when are we going to start talking about this? Because we should. This is a long overdue topic. I think there's a reason why you probably can't find a single person who can explain to you what cybernetics is. The closest you will probably get is somebody saying, oh, isn't that about like computers and the internet and stuff or something? I mean, that's probably the best you're going to get, okay? And it is so much more than that. And that is why we made the film that we made. So if you think you know what the film we made is about, if you're one of those people that said, I know what that film's about, I respectfully disagree. I thought I knew what it was about too. And 3.5 years later, wow, okay? My entire concept of all of this stuff has totally changed. Anyways, plan to do more videos. We are a little bit run down right now because of all the work that we just did. But we're coming back. We have several more movies we want to make, so that's already happening. And I really appreciate everybody who has stuck by us. And we love you guys. So, talk to you soon.
Put him in their project.
Now, can you tell me if there's any change now? Can you tell me if there's any change now?
He was lying in bed. His head was covered with a tent of newspapers. He was in terror. He said, "Doctors from Boston are trying to get my brain."
Where science and secrecy merge.
The aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will.
In the minds of men.
One thing to realize about systems is how they are controlled. And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it.